Well, I really had a very happy childhood. We didn't have much money, but you don't have to have a lot of money to be happy. Most of my childhood I lived in a rented house, but in this rented house we still had lots of fun. There was a huge oak tree outside, and my friend and I used to climb up that tree and have apartments up there. Then we would have served tea right in the tree, and really had a wonderful time. My mother would be kind of worried because every once in a while I'd start going higher and higher and higher, and then she'd just get really mad because I would be up too high. So I have to come down a little bit. We had wonderful family reunions, and my Uncle Paul was a singer in addition to being a football player. So we would have these gatherings out on what you call Lake Pewaukee at a family's called Giles Belknap, who was my second cousin, I guess. I've never quite figured out all these relationships. We would have about 60 people at these reunions, and Uncle Paul would lead singing, and my grandmother would play the piano for the singing. And that was lots of fun. And my Uncle Paul would lead all the old songs, which of course people wouldn't know anything about now. But it was just lots of fun, and he would get you all pepped up, and I remember those with great joy. Also, I remember wonderful things about that same house because my cousin Giles owned a great, huge Magnavox. It was the very best reproducing machine possible at that time because they had lots of money. Well, I would be invited out to swim with the kids and to play with them. So we'd swim a while, and then they would come in. We'd everybody get dressed, and everybody go out to play again, except for me. And I would sit at that machine and listen to Rachmaninoff's recordings. To this day, I can remember sitting at Cousin Giles' knee, listening to those recordings, and just being absolutely thrilled. One of the things he played, which I just dearly love, was the polka for WD. It took me a long time to find that because it's not in every book, but I finally found it and learned it myself, but it hardly sounded like Rachmaninoff. So this was an early beginning for me for music because I was just inspired to do music, and that's really all I ever wanted to do. We lived in Waukesha from the time I was in about 7th grade until I was about 9th grade. So we moved to Milwaukee on a street called Sherman Boulevard. It was only 3 blocks from the high school. There was a huge church called First Congregational. Milton Rush was the conductor of the choirs there. They had a choir for high schoolers, and I joined that, so I went to a rehearsal every week. This was an excellent experience for me because it was a marvelous chorus, and he was probably the best conductor in Wisconsin. My high school music teacher, as soon as he found out that I could play the piano, I became the accompanist for the chorus. But that was an excellent experience for me because I was forced to sight read really fast. His name was Mr. Smith, and I dearly loved him. At the same time, we were in a church where the minister recommended that I be sent to Camp Minnewanka. So I didn't know a thing about Camp Minnewanka. But when I got to Camp Minnewanka, we had such stimulus to do the best we could, to do better than we were doing. discover our own selves and our own place in the world, they had a questionnaire that you have to fill out. And if you get certain scores, then they'll say, well, you're fairly well-rounded, because they wanted you to be well-rounded physically, spiritually, mentally, and socially. When I got back to school after my first camp experience, I thought, if I'm going to get a better score, because my score wasn't very good that first year, if I'm going to get a better score, I better do something about leadership, because it was a leadership training camp. So I decided, oh, we need a music club in school. So I formed a music club, and we had a very big club, and I was the first president. We must have had 100, 150 members, and our first speaker was Milton Rush. We had a good time that year with our music club. So this is my first experience with leadership. I was also very lucky to have a special drama teacher. She was a teacher who would set us in a circle, and she would say, now, we're going to begin telling a story, and each one of you is going to have 30 seconds. 30 seconds here, pass it on, 30 seconds, 30 seconds. It gave you had to be really on your toes, and you had to be ready to go, and it had to be all improvised. This taught me a lot about improvisation, speaking-wise. She also gave me a wonderful freedom to be able to get up in front of people and speak freely and feel perfectly at home. She taught us to do things like watch people and see how they move, that you could learn a lot about people just from the way they move. At the end of my senior year, my parents decided they would move to a suburb of Milwaukee called Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. It's right outside, or runs right into Milwaukee. Instead of leaving the home for college, I went right to the Milwaukee State Teachers College, which is now the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee State Teachers College had an excellent music department. And furthermore, I had discovered a marvelous teacher there named Ralph Tillman. So I studied with him, and he was probably the best teacher I've ever had, including even Eastman. He had studied with Joseph Levine in Russia for 5 years, so he had this background of, for instance, the feeling for mazurka that you don't get if you're just a plain American. But you have to have this background of people who have danced them and who have played them in Europe. So I got this from Mr. Tillman, which was a wonderful experience for me. He gave me an excellent background in Bach and in Chopin of all kinds, and also led me into some of the moderns. Mr. Tillman was also at odds with most of the staff of the music department, because he felt that students must learn by ear, that they must not just use their eyes, but they must have very sharp ears. So he said you must teach major and minor in what you call the parallel relationship, in which the bottom note is the same for major and minor, rather than relative relationship, in which the bottom note for the major is a third above the minor that borrows the key signature. Whereas the rest of the faculty just fought this. But that didn't bother my teacher, and he just kept on teaching it his way. And from him I got this idea of teaching this way, and I still use those teaching techniques in my own teaching now. Milwaukee State Teachers College is near the Lake Michigan. So sometimes in my lunch hour, I would go walking away from the school towards the lake. And sometimes I saw the most beautiful birds in the trees. Oh, it's just gorgeous. I saw a cerulean warbler. Maybe you don't know what that is, but it's a beautiful blue warbler. I saw that, and I would see the most beautiful birds in the spring. Milton Rush that you've heard me speak about was my harmony teacher and my music history teacher. Music history was fascinating because instead of teaching music history the way most people teach music history, he divided the class into 7 groups. And each of us belonged to one of them. Like, for instance, if I belonged to the history part, then I'd have to know the history of a certain period. Then he divided our history into periods of 50 years. There would be 2 people in each group who were responsible for one the social conditions, one the history, one the political conditions, and so forth. So they had these, one the art, one the sculptor, so they had these 7 different groups, so that each group had to study its particular its particular time in history in great depth, which was very interesting, and it prepared me for what I did later on. I'll explain. But it also gave me the feeling that music wasn't by itself. It wasn't just an isolated thing that you learned and you enjoyed with your friends, but it was part of history. This was a marvelous approach, and I think it's the best approach you could use even today.
Betty would get up and dance. So if I was working on a Bach dance or a waltz, a Schumann waltz or a Chopin waltz, Betty would not stay in the chair. She would stand up and show the movement and show how the music fits. The timing of the music fits with the movement. And I was actually, she knew this about me, but she would find out what is the student interested in. And in high school, I did international folk dancing and contra dancing, and so I think she probably danced with all of her students, but whether it was drawing, she would show me things she would have students draw when I would visit her later. Really, she would talk about really trying to tap into their interests, to make that connection for them with the music. And so for myself, I really appreciated the dancing and the movement and the thinking of the music, not as just something happening on the keyboard, but something really alive.
She would dance, and literally make me dance, because we're trying to feel the music and trying to express ourselves and trying to relate to music through dance, because they're all intermingled and interspersed. And there's not a stop point, and they're all interrelated. Just like Debussy, she would talk about how it relates to Monet and his impressionistic paintings, and that our fingers are paintbrushes and we're brushing along the keyboard, we're not just playing notes.
In our lessons, we would discuss music theory and technique. She was very strong on, but also she would interweave music history of the composers and tell you a little bit stories about the composers with your music. One thing that was always nice was we would laugh. She was so fun and funny, and there was always something to talk about with Betty.
She always wanted people to be constantly rediscovering music, discovering new things about music, and just, invigorating discussions, and she loved having discussions about music, and I always loved that, that she was constantly learning.
About the end of my sophomore year, my mother and father said to me, "Mr. Tillema thinks you need a new piano. And if you'd like to stay one more year, then we'll get you that piano with the money that we'd have to send you off to school with." So I went to look at the piano and fell in love with it, and that's the one that's in our living room today. It was a marvelous piano. It was a piano that the company had gotten in as a B. It's a concert B. They had 3 concert Bs, and they decided that was more than they needed. They decided they were going to get rid of this one. And Mr. Tillamook told us about it. So we went down and looked at it, and sure enough, we purchased it. You won't guess how much we paid for it. It was $2,500. $2,500. I stayed at Milwaukee State Teachers College for 1 more year, gave several recitals, and enjoyed it really a lot. However, it was very cold when you got to Lake Michigan, and the temperature was 0, and the wind was blowing, and it was 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 feet of snow, and you had to walk to school from the bus. So I well remember standing on that corner and freezing to death. So I got this lovely piano and really thoroughly enjoyed it for a year at home in Wauwatosa. At the end of that year, we decided that it would be wise for me to move to Lawrence. So I signed up for Lawrence. Lawrence is quite a different school from Milwaukee State Teachers College. It's full of sororities and fraternities. I went to the sorority parties and decided I didn't want to become a sorority member, except maybe there was one music sorority called an SAI, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll join that one. So I did pledge an SAI, but my teacher, Ralph Tillema in Milwaukee, said, you better take your piano with you. And so Lawrence College allowed me to have a room in the conservatory and have my piano put in there. So I had my own piano, my own room. Well, of course, all the faculty thought, that's a spoiled brat, and she's an only child. I studied with a teacher there, was the best teacher. But she taught me a completely different approach to the piano. And some of it was very tension-producing. So I would go back once a month to take a lesson with Mr. Tillema in Milwaukee. And when he saw what was happening to my technique, he was abhorred. And he said, you can't study with that teacher anymore. After this first semester, you stop studying with that teacher and don't study with her anymore. Well, she happened to be the sponsor of SAI. It was a big mess. So when I went back to school, I told them I was not going to study with that teacher after that semester. The teacher just exploded and said, first of all, she's not going to be allowed to join SAI. You must not let her be a member of SAI. So I said, that's all right, doesn't bother me at all. I guess she thought I was being punished, but I didn't feel a bit punished. Instead of taking piano that last semester, I took organ. Well, my organ teacher was fantastic. Best organ teacher I can ever imagine. I graduated from Lawrence.
What year was that?
1940. And then went on to Eastman School of Music for the best years of my life, because I loved Eastman. And I was fortunate in being there at really one of the best times in Eastman's life also, because Howard Hanson was the director, and he felt that all people should study with a variety of teachers, if necessary, and open you to all kinds of experiences. Furthermore, for him, because he was a composer, he felt that modern music needed to be understood and tried to expose us to as much as possible. So for 1 week solid, they would have people on the Eastman stage playing music that was created at that time.
I've loved playing, and I still love, and discovering a lot of new music, and you know, contemporary composers, and I think she was part of, you know, getting me into that, and just always on the lookout for new sounds and new ways of doing things.
At Eastman, everybody had his or her own room. So I had a single room, and next to me, lived a freshman, Flora, and I loved Flora. Flora was a member of our group, and she studied with a different teacher. I studied with Sandra Vosh there. She studied with the person that I considered the best teacher probably in the school. Her name is Mrs. Genhardt. So I was trying to get the most value out of my piano study. So after every one of Flora's lessons, I'd say, "Okay, Flora, what'd you study today?" So she'd fill me in on all the background that Mrs. Genhardt gave her. So I was able to get the best of Mrs. Genhardt and the best of Mr. Sander Vosh. And I've used a lot of Mrs. Genhardt's teaching in my teaching through the years. The wonderful thing about Eastman was that unlike all my other undergraduate work, where I would have maybe 4 teachers, and out of the 4, 2 of them would be just wonderful. When I got to Eastman, there were no poor teachers. They were all just wonderful. So I loved my year at Eastman. Well, at the end of that year, of course, I needed a job. So my father knew the president of Berea College, so I was invited to go to Berea to be interviewed for a job. Well, it wasn't very long after that I found out that I got the job. Berea is a college that's for Appalachian students, because these Appalachian students sometimes don't have enough money to even buy shoes. They just have no money at all. So when you go to Berea, you have to work at least 10 hours a week. And usually they work many more hours than that in addition to their schoolwork. So it's a very interesting school, and I enjoyed my 2 years there very, very much.
Said to Betty, "No, I have 2 dimes. Subway was a dime each. So we'd either walk and take a subway back, or we'd take a subway there and walk back." I said, "Well, let's walk." So we walked from 122nd Street to 181st. We started out at 122nd, and I was not committed. By 181st, I was head over heels. It did it, believe me.
Mr. Nolting were, of course, Episcopalians, and they were very well-rounded in philosophy and in environmental concerns and human concerns. For example, addiction and poverty and the things that they worked with Mr. Nolting did. And this spread into her music and into just the character that she gave students, such a good example, a mentor of how good living was.
You know, she wanted people to make music a part of their lives, but I think that somehow in the teaching of it and all that, she's creating good people too, inspiring them with good values, and I think that there's such a need to get people, talking to each other and working with each other again, and music is certainly a wonderful thing for that, because it's always a collaborative process.
So when I moved here, I became active in the Atlanta Music Teachers. There were about 4 groups in the Atlanta area at the time, and I became president of the Atlanta Music Teachers Association. So from 78 to 80, I became state president. I had a wonderful person helping me, and she was my program chairman. And she was also very interested in art, and so we decided it would be nice to have a 5 arts convention. The one group we could have would be the Baroque dance group from New York. Baroque dance people, we asked to not just give us a performance, but to teach us how to do a Baroque dance the next day. Now, Baroque dancing is completely different from regular dancing in that on beat 1, you come up, you precede it by a plie, and then you come up on the toes for beat 1. And all the waltzes and everything I'd ever learned, the polkas, you always go down on beat 1. With Baroque dancing, you come up on beat 1, which gives you this smooth flow, which is just incredible. And once you've done it, you don't ever play Baroque music dancing that way. Meantime, I was teaching a huge load of students, and my students got better and better and better. I had students who were winning all kinds of competitions. But anyway, I have had marvelous students in Atlanta. So that has been a great joy to me to teach these wonderful students. Meantime, I gave recitals, and I enjoyed performing. Also, if you perform, you share your performing experiences, your fears, your concerns, and you can talk to your students students about their concerns because you've been through it yourself. Helped tremendously. Meantime, I discovered that you do not teach an advanced student without much preparation. And so sometimes I would spend 5 to 6 hours getting ready for one lesson. And if there was a piece I didn't know, I made myself learn it so that I'd know the technical problems, the musical problems before that student walked in the door. But since I didn't know the piece, I'd sometimes have to spend many hours and sometimes a week or so learning a piece before a student did, because I felt you shouldn't ever teach unless you knew it yourself.
She's a phenomenal model for all teachers that, you know, the minute you think you know it all, you've stopped learning. You know, there's always something new to learn. And she had such a joy about her always. You know, she was a person that knows that they're where they're supposed to be.
So I enjoyed my contact both with my students, and I certainly loved my contact with my adults.
I actually went back to school to learn how to be get a piano pedagogy degree. And as important as anything I learned in school were my visits about once a year with Betty over maybe a decade, where I would come and talk to her about what I was teaching, and she would share her thoughts and her ideas.
It's a loss not having her here. But I believe that just as she and I had this connection when I was in my accident, she didn't know about it when I was 18. I was hit by a motorcycle and it was very close to death. And she told me the same night she woke up in the middle of the night, and she would say, and I remember her telling me this over the years, and she would always tell me with this sense of awe, like shock, how did this happen? And she would say, fight, Farrah, fight. She woke up saying this over and over again, and she said she just kept saying it. And then later she heard about the accident, and she had this connection with me, and I feel like that connection, it went across hundreds of miles, but I also believe in the fact that she and I still have that connection, that she is taken a different form.
She was encouraging for so many facets of my life so far, and she's still with me every day because I practice piano every day, and I think about her every day because music is a part of my life every day, and it's part of everyone's lives. And I think the most important lesson that she taught was how to listen, and that listening isn't waiting to speak, and listening is being open-hearted and open-minded and caring. Everything she touched, she affected, and that's what we, as people, all want to get to, is that point where we're inspired and we have enough wisdom that we can impart our own spirits onto those that we bring into our lives, and thus affect change in their lives. And I feel like she was certainly that for me and my sister and all the people that she taught and that came through the house.
Whether it was pulling taffy or making ice cream, swimming in the pool, there was it was like going to Grandma's house, you know, and that house is, you know, it's a special house. I know that, you know, obviously someone else is living there now, but I'm like, boy, if those walls could talk, you know, it's there's got to be a spirit in that house of all the fantastic times and lessons and learning and things that happen there.